The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Weiss, and I'm the Director of Education and Events for AGRiP. Thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Our webinar, Resetting Your Contribution Algorithm, will provide an update and overview on the importance of your pool's contribution algorithm. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a couple of logistical notes for you. First, all attendees are automatically muted. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat question field on the webinar panel. Questions that are directly related to the information at hand will be addressed as we go. We'll also record this presentation and post it and related materials to the AGRiP website later in the week so that you can watch it again, or if you choose, share it with colleagues. The last comment I'd like to make is that if you look at your screen, there's an area at the top where you can zoom and change your screen view so that slides are larger or smaller depending upon your personal preference. Our presenter today is Chris Kogut, a principal of Milliman Incorporated, and Milliman, as you know, is a global actuarial consulting firm. Chris is a fellow of the Casualty Actuarial Society, FCAS, and she's a member of the American Academy of Actuaries, MAAA. I'm excited that Chris has joined us for this webinar because she originally presented at our event in San Diego this past March. Her session was very well received, and so we're grateful that she was open to the idea of sharing a sharply focused version of her presentation here today. Chris has more than 20 years of actuarial consulting experience. She focuses her work on innovative and developing market areas, including insurance-linked securities or alternative capital, predictive analytics, autonomous vehicles, and risk pooling. Chris is a frequent speaker on actuarial topics and has written many articles, including recent publications on quantifying the costs of state presumption disability laws and the impact from autonomous vehicles on the insurance market. I'd like to turn it over now to Chris Kogut for the webinar, Resetting Your Contribution Algorithm. Chris?
Thank you for that introduction, Stephanie. Hello to everybody on the call. As Stephanie mentioned, I was able to present this topic at AGRiP, the AGRiP conference 2 months ago. And for those of you that have seen me speak, you know that I like to walk around the room. So this webinar is going to be a test to see if I can actually present while not walking. So I'll do my best. But welcome to the webinar. In most pools, rating formulas and underwriting guidelines have evolved over time in response to changes in risk characteristics, market conditions, member expectations, and management objectives. Often, the source and purpose of various risk quantification elements cannot easily be identified or remembered. The consequence of these cumulative changes is that individual member contributions may no longer align with the risk borne for each pool member, even if the underwriters follow the formula and the overall funding number is adequate. How can pools respond to questions raised by the regulators, the board, their members, with respect to levels of individual contributions? So there's 3 goals for today's webinar. Our first goal is to discuss which situations would prompt a review of your current funding allocation. Second topic is, once set in motion, what are the objectives to accomplish within this evaluation process? And then lastly, throughout this process, what are the important considerations, benefits, and consequences of resetting your contribution algorithm? Today, we will illustrate the approaches used in 3 case studies to show you how to evaluate your current funding allocation and determine the best way to re-underwrite your members. For each study, we will explain the situation prompting the review, the objectives, a subset of the results, as these projects were rather vast and detailed, so we're not going to go through all of the results. We've just picked out a few results to point out here, but it's not all encompassing. And then finally, we'll talk about the suggestions or outcomes of our analyses. Okay. First, when I think about designing a underwriting program or pricing guidelines, I want to look to see what resources do we have currently available to us. So I went to the AGRiP operations manual, and there is a funding section within the manual. It's 5 pages long, and it says, just sort of basically that, actuarial studies, not only should it help with funding levels or prior reserve liabilities, but really kind of help in assisting setting rates for future periods. The other thing that it indicates is that funding should consider rates that are calculated at least partially on the basis of members' loss experiences. Okay, so just sort of some basic guidelines there, not too much to go on. And then I went to the Casualty Actuarial Society and looked at their manuals that they had there. So they have a basic rate making manual. Mine is just basic rate making. That's 423 pages long. And Chapter 9 specifically talks about traditional risk classification. So it says that the goal of classification rate making is to determine a rate that is commensurate with the individual risk. The rating variables should be statistically significant, risk differentiator, and the levels of a rating variable should represent distinct groups of risk with similar expected costs. And it mentions that adverse selection deals with the case where a company or pool fails to segment based on meaningful characteristics. So these are the types of principles that we need to apply to our pool algorithms. In further thinking about industry comparisons, I thought the best way to really look at an underwriting or pricing program is to think about the loss ratio, because that's really what the result is. So what is the loss ratio? How well you're pricing your risk? How well are you matching up premium to losses? So I went and I gathered some industry data on loss ratios. So the second column shows results for AGRiP member pools, and this is 2016, and I got these numbers from AGRiP from their benchmark initiative. And we couldn't really segment it too much. This is all pools, all types of members, all states combined. And just sort of focusing on the top line there, it showed the loss ratio. So we have about a 74% loss ratio across all the pools. When I compare that to the commercial lines carriers, 2016, same year, they have about a 66% loss ratio. Again, so that's all carriers, all lines of business. So there is some differential there. However, when I looked into it further, I looked to see, what are the coverages that pools mainly write, and kind of looked to see what the commercial carriers had for loss ratios for those individual coverages. And I saw that work comp was about 68%, commercial auto was 84%, and other liability was 79%. So when you segment down that 66%, you can see that for the coverages that pools write, it's more in line with the overall loss ratio that we are seeing. One thing to note, though, for 2016 in general, the commercial carriers took a 2% rate decrease. So looks like they've decreased their rates going into 2016. Whereas AGRiP, on the other hand, the pools generally had a 3.5% increase in contributions. So that would include both rate and exposure changes. So when I think further about the industry, regulation and competition varies widely by state, by region, and by line of coverage. The commercial rating plans, generally work comp is highly regulated and generally bureau-based, whereas for other coverages, generally you see a schedule rating or an individual risk modification plan. The criteria and the maximum credits and debits vary by state. Generally, it's plus or minus 25%, but it can be up to plus or minus 40%. So having said this, it just really makes it difficult to compare the rating plans to each other, and then from the industry to the pool. So we really kind of have, we don't have a great guideline to look at to sort of benchmark off of. So we have to determine what is best for each and every pool individually, as there isn't one right approach for everybody. So when thinking about the reasons why we would want to reevaluate our contribution algorithm, I've come up with 8 reasons, and I've grouped them into 3 distinct categories. The first category is external influences. So perhaps there are legislative changes in your state where there is enhanced scrutiny of your operations. Perhaps you've lost a very large and good performing member to the commercial market over rate for those pools that are competitive. Other reasons from an operational perspective, perhaps you want to gain new members, perhaps there's an opportunity maybe where the commercial carrier in your state has pulled out and you can write new members. Maybe you just want to provide a basis for selecting risks to participate in your various credit programs. You want to make sure you're selecting that risk appropriately, and perhaps even to validate the impact of those programs, making sure those programs are working as you intend them to. And then also, does your total line of business or program contribution collected, is it less than the actuarial indication? Are there poor performing members that are driving up the rate that are being subsidized by better performing members, and you have concerns, competitive concerns about rate increases? You want to think about that. And then the third category is due diligence. Perhaps some reasons to just reevaluate your algorithm is just a checkup to ensure that your members are being charged actuarially sound rates. Perhaps you want to evaluate the impact of various assumptions, such as the impact of shock losses. Or you maybe just want to gain additional statistical support for your current underwriting rules and or perhaps pricing factor improvements. Okay, so now we're going to identify the issues, important issues, ideally before you go through this process of resetting your contribution algorithm. So the 6 areas that we've identified here are objectives, considerations, implementation, board role, consequences, and benefits. And we'll go through each one of these individually. So before you reset your contribution algorithm, you really want to identify the objectives as why you would go through this process. And I've identified two potential objectives. One could be just sort of housekeeping. Perhaps you just want, to illustrate to your members and to regulators and to the board that you have, a pooling practices agreement in place as to how you underwrite risk, and that you've gone through your due diligence on that. Perhaps you just want to, make small improvements to your current rating algorithm. Perhaps you just want to evaluate and make sure that, there is equity amongst all your members if you haven't looked at your program in a while. And maybe you want to think about if there's some program subsidies, how you can address those. So that's what I kind of call sort of housekeeping objectives. Alternatively, you could come into this process with planning to have significant changes in mind. So this would be situations where you want to reconstruct your internal rating model to encompass all the results of these underwriting or these analytic outcomes. Or perhaps you want to design a brand new underwriting rule or tiering structure or other pricing elements. So really kind of coming at it from a complete overhaul perspective. Also, before you reset your algorithm, there's certain considerations that I've identified that you should think about. First, alternatives to changing or increasing rates. So assuming that the results of this work could involve in rate increases for some members, is there other things that you could do outside of increasing their rates? Maybe you think about a deductible, introducing a deductible to them that would keep their rate lower and that would reduce the risk to the pool. Or perhaps you can think about using different percentiles or safety margins in your funding requirements. So I know a lot of pools will fund at a higher percentile, or they have a specific safety margin in place when they think about funding. And maybe if the results of this analysis say that you don't need as much funding, or you need more funding, perhaps it's some adjustment to those percentiles or margins that you could consider before making any rate changes. You also want to consider the rollout of the reset. So how are you going to apply any rating algorithm changes? And this is really kind of thinking about an initial shock to your members versus a phased-in approach. And then lastly, some implications to consider. Your underwriting system, can it sustain modification? What would be the cost to changing the program? And then certainly we need to keep in mind member relations. Implementation, when we're implementing the change in the rating algorithm, change in the underwriting rules, Do we want to make sure that we're matching contributions to the actuarial indications? This would serve to eliminate any subsidies that you see between your programs and between members. And then, how are you going to go about changing that pool rating algorithm? Are you going to keep the current program in place and just add ad hoc adjustments to it? Are you going to scrap the whole thing and start with a new program to calculate member rates, or is it going to be some hybrid of those two? The board is certainly going to need to be involved in this process at the onset to get approval to go through the process, and then certainly at the end when you're making decisions about what to do with the results. So to the extent that the results suggest that you need to increase rate for your members, maybe the board could opine on using surplus, any excess surplus, to soften the positive rate impact change to your members. So instead of getting additional rate out of the funding element, you would take it from surplus, and that would be the board would need to approve that. How are you going to transition members to the new program? Are you going to do it, again, at one point in time, or are you going to roll it out over multiple years? And the board would certainly need to be advised as to strategy there. You certainly want to keep in mind and consider the price sensitivity of members, particularly if you're in a competitive environment, and perhaps even think about if you, instead of increasing rate, or in addition to increasing rate for certain members, maybe you add on additional member services to sort of suggest that there's other things that you're providing in addition to that rate increase to offset some of that rate increase. So all of these decisions you're going to need to make at the end, and your board needs to be involved throughout the process and make sure that they're on board all along. Some consequences you might run into depending on the results of this analysis. You may see large disruptions in the rate for certain members, which could impact member relations. And again, you need to evaluate, you need to decide how you're going to evaluate that, and then perhaps, are you going to look at that again every year or every few years? How are you going to reevaluate that situation just to make sure that you're on the right track with these disruptions? Your administration systems may not be sophisticated enough to implement changes, so that could be a hurdle right at the very beginning that you need to consider to say, we can't overhaul our algorithm if we can't administer it properly. So that's something that you need to certainly consider. And then sort of members that may experience large swings from year to year, sort of be mindful that could happen depending on the algorithm that you put in place and the individual member's experience, and just how that is going to be implemented and monitored and communicated to them going forward is important. And then lastly, the benefits. What are the benefits of going through this process? I mean, really, the hope is to avoid adverse selection. You're rating the risk properly. You want to make sure that your members are treated fairly. I think we all want that, and that's always been the purpose of the pools. Of course, we want to make sure that we're complying with the regulators. But I would say, important as well is we want to make sure we're prepared for the next disruptor. If we've got if another pool enters our market, or the commercial carrier enters our market, we want to make sure we're competitively placed. And then certainly also, this could be an opportunity to potentially influence member behavior in order to reduce losses. If they feel the pain and they understand that bad loss experience means the rate increases, perhaps they do a little bit more in the risk management area, which I think is what we all want. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is we spent about the first 15 minutes going through an overview, sort of talking about major considerations. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to spend the next half hour or so going through 3 individual case studies. So these are projects that I've done for pools in the last couple of years. And just to sort of illustrate and talk to you about, these pools that went through the same exact process, why they did it, what their objectives were, and sort of the results of our analysis, and sort of the intuitive findings that we shared with them. Okay, so this first case study, it was an underwriting predictive analytics analysis that we did. So just a brief overview of this pool. They provide auto GL work comp coverages. They do include municipalities and schools, and they have over 450 members. Their rating algorithm generally started with a stationary base rate. with some tweaks to it. Their members select the individual coverages, and they were increasing the use of their credit programs in order to promote enhanced risk management across the membership. The goals of pool management for going through this process is they wanted to enhance the process for allocating risk costs to members. They wanted to gain support for any new underwriting rules or pricing improvements. And they wanted to provide a basis for selecting risks to participate in the various credit programs, and also to validate the impact of those programs. So what were their final objectives? They did want to reconstruct the internal rating model completely to encompass the results of these analytics outcomes, with a particular focus on the credit programs. They wanted to look at their credit programs, see who was getting a credit, see who, making sure that was working properly, and really even to see were these credit programs working, were they reducing risk as they were designed to do. Okay, so in thinking about, kind of getting into the details of the analysis for this pool, as I mentioned, the main focus was the credit program. So just briefly, here's the 5 programs that they had in place. So they had a risk management credit, which gave a 5% credit on all lines of business. And you got this credit by receiving a 100% score on a risk management guideline survey, which just basically was about 20 or 30 questions, and it collected information from the pool on its risk in its risk management areas. So you got a 5% credit on all lines of business if you got a 100% score on that guideline. They offered a law enforcement credit, which was 5% credit on LE premium, and if you participated in various loss enforcement accreditation programs. They had an auto liability credit, which was also 5% on AL premium, and there was various participating criteria. They had a work comp scheduled credit debit, up to 15% credit debit, and again, certain criteria for that. The P&L scheduled credit and debit was up to 15% credit debit. I'm sorry, it was up to a maximum of 25% credit debit based on certain qualifications, and it included an experience mod adjustment. So these were the credit programs that we looked at. So this slide illustrates the results of our analysis, and just want to get you acclimated with the information that's on this slide. So bucket N and Y, so no and yes. So no, the member does not participate in this program, does not receive this credit, and yes, that they do. So the exposure percentage shows the premium for all the members combined, the incurred loss for all the members combined in this bucket, the loss ratio, the record count, claim count, frequency, severity. Okay, so those are the numbers in the table. And then the graph shows the bars are the exposure weighted, or this exposure. So the bars represent the premium of the members in that bucket. So the N bar, they do not get the credit, and the Y, yes, they do get the credit. And then the lines show the loss ratio. So it shows the loss ratio by year, and I have 6 accident years of experience that I'm showing here, 2007 through 2012. So as you can see, the loss ratio, and that when we calculate the loss ratio, we're using a manual rate. So this is the rate or the premium before the credit is applied. So we want to take the credit out of our results and look at everything apples to apples on a manual rate basis. So when we take the credit out, look at manual rate, we can see that the loss ratio, losses divided by that manual premium, for the members that participate in the risk management, that get this risk management guide credit, is lower than the ones that don't. So this indicates to us that the credit does differentiate good versus bad risk when reviewing the loss ratios across all lines of business. However, as I mentioned, because this credit is applied to all lines of business. However, when we looked into this further, we did see that statistics by program or by line of coverage indicate that the results have room to grow by coverage. So the pool would be better served by applying the credit on a coverage by coverage basis, and so therefore applying or providing or getting information from the guidelines on a coverage by coverage basis, and this credit would be more effective if it did that, if it broke it up by coverage as opposed to all coverages combined. Now we looked at the other credit programs as well, but specifically we looked at the results of the work comp scheduled credit debit. So here, the bucket, no, they do not get a credit debit, they get a credit, or they get a debit. There are the three different categories that we have here. And again, we're showing the on-level manual premium, so before any credit is applied, the incurred losses, and it shows the loss ratio. So the bar shows here, so we've got most members by volume of by height of the bar, most members do not get this credit. But of the ones that do, you can see that there isn't much difference between the experience of the members that get a credit versus those that don't participate in this. Versus a debit, you can see that the folks that get a debit, so they're charged more, do actually have higher loss ratios. So what we can see from this result is that the debit is a better indicator of bad loss ratio than the credit is of the good. So the debit looks good, it differentiates the risk, but there's more work to be done from a credit basis. It's sort of like distinguishing out of all the risks really which ones are the better ones, because we can't really tell from these statistics which are the better risks. Another thing that we looked at was auto liability and their rating program, their rating algorithm. And the way that they do their rating is they do not differentiate by vehicle type. So there is a rating category for a territory, but not by vehicle type. So in our analysis, we looked at the losses by vehicle type to sort of distinguish, is there differentiation in the risk based on the vehicle type? And what you can see here, this table sort of provides an overview of the results. So with loss ratios being the bars on the top and the vehicle counts being on the bottom. And what you can see is that, certainly for some territories, there is a differentiation in emergency versus school bus versus light truck vehicles. So, it suggests that there is insight here, and that the pool could consider adjustments to their base rate to define the vehicle type. And that would be consistent with ISO methodology. And here, this is just a summary of their rating program. So you can see, so this is broken out, this pool, how they rate these risks. They broke out, it's categorized by the rate, the base rate. And really, so it puts the base rate into grouping. So if the rate is from $0 to $367 and so forth, and groups the base rates. And what we would expect to see is a fairly consistent loss ratio regardless of what the base rate is. And what we're seeing here in the column, the loss ratio column, is there is certainly some discrepancy, for the sort of band of rates in the middle. So from sort of 400 to 450, there seems to be higher loss ratios than there is at the lower or the higher rates, which suggests that there is some refinement that could be done there to better tailor the risk, the rate to the risk. And this is just how this pool rates these vehicles, as you can see. So they've got one rate, so one territory has one rate for all types of vehicles. So a bus, regardless of how many passengers, transit or school, basically has the same rate. And then a different territory has a slightly different rate than Territory 2 has a different rate than Territory 3, but really all of the vehicles within that territory are rated exactly the same. And so our analysis and ISO support an adjustment to the rate variables to include type of vehicle for risk characterization. And just one other thing that we looked at here staying on the auto liability rating is we looked at the results. We wanted to break out the loss ratio results by year by member type. And so the overall loss ratio for auto was 45%. So you can see, obviously, there's going to be variability between the different accident years. But when we look at the overall across all accident years, the results on the right-hand side, and we look how that compares to member type, you can see that, schools, it's not too much greater than the average, but most of their exposures is in school. So even if they were going to make a small change to the rating algorithm, it could result in a significant rate dollar change because that's where most of their exposure is. So that's just something to think about, when you're thinking about making changes, really what is the overall impact to the dollars of that change. Okay, so I'm going to go just kind of quickly through some of the overall results that we came up with from this analysis. Just quickly here, so as we mentioned, the Risk Management Guide program, it differentiates risks, but it could be better used on a per line basis. The auto and law enforcement risks do not differentiate the risks very well. Work comp does a good job of differentiating bad risks but not good risks, and then the GL did a pretty good job of differentiating both bad and good risks. Other things we found in our analysis is that the segments for all lines, all members point to distinctions between member type and line of business, which suggests that they should continue to rate their risk by member type and by line of business. The size of members does matter. However, it only becomes significant within the member, within the line type. So once you categorize all of your members, say schools, then if you look at size of the member within that grouping, there is an opportunity to differentiate the risk. By member, by line model results, again, provides that size of member is an indicator, but based on exposure, not on premium. And we suggested some refinements to their tiering structure. And then we go into this case study that was sort of the overall. The case study goes in, as you can see, and looks at and makes recommendations or observations for each member type, for each line of business. So this is school, work comp, talks about size of school matters, different segmentations, different observations that we had. Continuing on, school and work comp credit debit programs being applied appropriately to smaller schools. Some things to think about there. Then we looked at some member cities for line of business work comp. You know, larger cities, the policies appear to perform better. And then just some overall considerations that we had for this pool as going through this analysis. Data availability for each school member. So what they were doing is they were gathering school level data for all schools combined. And we suggested that they gather the data on a school level. So each school within their district, if they gathered data for each school, we'd be able to do better analysis on that and be able to rate the risk perhaps on a school-based level. They were also capturing all of their liability credits and debits in bulk, so it just was one number. And really the best practices is to record each calculation separately. So you can see the experience mod separate from each credit debit for each program, separate from any judgmental adjustments. They had limited information on member loyalty. We suggested collecting that information. The risk management guide questions had some really great questions, but they were equally weighted, and we considered perhaps weighting those differently based on the corresponding risk and losses that uncovered. Safety inspections were done for larger members, and it suggested that perhaps that should be done for smaller members. Some tiering on policy premium we suggested. One thing we noted for them is they used the members that used the online university courses seem to have a positive impact. So our suggestions were to expand programs around that, expand the credit around that, and perhaps even add that to their risk management guide questionnaire as far as use of that and the extent of using that information. And then again, we talked about all vehicles being rated on the same rate base and sort of differentiating by vehicle type, and that would re-rate all of their policies, but it would be in line with ISO indications. Okay, so that was the results of our first case study, one pool. Our second case study is a similar approach, so we also did underwriting predictive analytics. For this particular pool, they offer same types of coverages, auto, general, work comp. It was municipalities and schools again, and they had over 500 members. For this particular pool, they had a relatively new rating program that they had implemented not long ago. Prior to that, they were using industry rates, some lost, some experience ratings, some discounts. And they wanted to focus this analysis on work comp, and they also had features within their rating algorithm that would limit the increases and decreases of the rates from year to year, what they called a cap program. Okay, so in their specific situation, there were some legislative changes in their state, and they wanted to just sort of review all of their operations, underwriting, and make sure that they were, underwriting that risk and pricing that risk appropriately so that they can communicate the processes with the regulators. They also, as a result of these legislative changes, also had an opportunity to gain many new members. So they were going to, perhaps, add 25, 30% to their pool member base, and they wanted to make sure that they were, pricing these risks correctly. And then the pool management was also concerned with just the, the allocation of risk costs among the members and in the programs, and they wanted a better selection process of risk to participate in these discount programs. They were using more of a judgmental approach previously. So their objectives through this analysis was to identify the factors that were predictive of loss, and they wanted to kind of look at the results separately for schools versus municipalities as opposed to combining the results for all pool members. They wanted support for new rating structures and rules. They wanted to make sure that their member contributions were actuarially derived funding requirements. They wanted to analyze the effectiveness of their new rating formula, and they wanted to have some regulatory documents in place. Okay. So first of all, we looked at their programs that they had in place and the eligibility guidelines around those programs, because they wanted to make sure that they had the right people in these programs and they were differentiating the risk appropriately. So they had a multi-year program. So this was a member came in and they agreed to sign on for coverage for a number of years, 3+ years. They had to sign up for both work comp and P&L, but they got discounts for being part of this multi-year program. They had what they called cultural assessments, which was were done for prospective members only, and it was prepared by their risk management staff consultants. And these consultants, once going through this assessment, would make a recommendation if this new member should be part of the MYA. Okay. They had loss mitigation conditions in place. They had 6 standard conditions in place, various programs and whatnot that the members had to meet. And then they had a couple of member-specific programs, sort of advanced driver training, special education support, et cetera, et cetera. So a few things like that. And then these loss mitigation conditions did apply to the members that participated in the multi-year agreement. And then also, lastly, they had this contribution assistance program, this CAP. So what this did is it said that for the work comp coverage, they would cap any increases at 8% annually. And for P&L, they would be capped at 7%. So in order for you to be as part of this cap, all you needed to do was be in the MYA. And that was it. There was no additional criteria. So you got cap if you were in the MYA and you asked for it. Okay. And remember, to be in the MYA, there was just some cultural assessments, some small loss mitigation conditions, but there wasn't a lot of underwriting rigor around being eligibility into the MYA. Okay. So the results of our analysis. So we went through, did our underwriting analysis, and at the end of the day, our suggestions for the pool were that there were certainly specific underwriting rules that we could improve upon. We had a lot of great predictive modeling results that we suggested that they utilize in their rating algorithm. And we also suggested that they sort of enhance their data collection, certainly around the cultural assessments and making decisions about those, and then the loss mitigation conditions and meeting those requirements, that they enhance some data requirements around that. Okay. So so this, again, we're just going to start to illustrate some of the results that we had for this analysis. So again, similar to the prior case study, the bars represent the volume or the premium in the, the exposures for this one. The exposures in the different buckets. So yes versus no. So yes would be, yes, they participate in the CAP program. So they have that cap on how much their rates can increase each year. So this is looking at just school members. So we look to see, okay, yes, the school members that are participating in CAP versus no, the school members that are not participating in CAP. And you can see that there is some differentiation there. So each line represents an accident year. So there's 5 accident years that are being represented here, and the black line represents an average of those 5 years. So there is, some differentiation there where, yes, indeed, the loss ratio for the members that are in CAP is lower than the loss ratio for the members that are not in the CAP program. So again, the loss ratio calculated on a manual rate that does not include that discount. So this just tends to differentiate the risk, and so obviously we would like to see a bigger differentiation here, but it still is differentiating the risk. So that seems to be working as intended. The caveat that maybe it could work a little bit better. For municipal members, when we looked at the program for just municipal members, we can see that the reverse is the case. So if you are not a member of CAP and you're a muni, you have a better loss ratio than if you are a member of CAP. So this runs counter to what they're trying to do here. So they have members that are getting a CAP, that will be getting a CAP on their rates, but they're not the best members. So they're not giving this program to the right folks. So this was obviously an area that they didn't realize was happening and need to further refine when they think about eligibility for these programs. So then we went into looked at the multi-year agreement. Remember, there's a lot of judgment going into what members get to go in the multi-year program. There's various discounts around that. When we looked at the municipal members, we can see, yes, there is in fact a distinction between members that do participate in MYA versus ones that don't. So your loss, there is a differentiation, the ones that do, that don't, but it's not what we would expect. So if you're in the multi-year agreement, you have a much higher loss ratio than those that are not in the multi-year agreement, okay? So again, this is not what they wanted to accomplish. So you've got folks that are in the multi-year, you're signing on to them for a couple of years, they get other benefits, they're gonna get discounts, they're gonna get into CAP, and they have higher loss ratios than those that don't. And we found in looking at this closer that the participants generally tended to have about 30% higher frequency and about 70% higher severity. So again, something that they weren't expecting that happened, and they needed to refine this this underwriting rule. Overall results that we found looking at some of the other rating variables is that segments by line, by member do point to distinction. So it is right to kind of look at things by member type and by line of business. We certainly found territory and representative groupings exhibiting differentials in results, so areas to refine their rating program there. And we found that their new rating algorithm that that's a few years old now, while it does show different results from prior years when it was not being implemented, it doesn't seem to be that it's always better in risk characterization. So they adopted a new rating algorithm that maybe perhaps isn't the best that they could do, and there may be further ways to improve this approach. So here I'm showing just some more graphics on the results. When we look at, as I mentioned, there's certainly an opportunity to distinguish the risk by member type. So when we look at the municipal members and we look at member type within that grouping, this shows the results of counties versus municipalities versus special districts. And we can see here that there is some differentiation, so particularly for the special districts. So the special districts have much higher loss ratios on average, and for some accident years than the municipalities and the counties do. So we want to make sure that it doesn't appear that they're differentiating that risk appropriately, particularly if they're applying one rate to all municipal members, that there is certainly a differentiation in the risk within the member type that they could take into account in their underwriting approach. And then we look at this same grouping, when we look at just frequency, you can see the big difference here. So you can see that special districts all years tend to have a much higher frequency than municipalities and counties. So again, just more illustration that they're missing an opportunity to better rate their risks by applying one rate to all municipal members. Some other key findings that we had from this analysis for this particular pool, they had various class code reporting issues that we noticed within their data analysis. Some results could be, we saw some interesting results around dominant hazard group. They certainly had poor performing class codes that could be addressed by improving the rating algorithm by class code. Tenure, there was an opportunity to utilize tenure collecting data, public school, or collecting data on the schools, in particular any public data could be advantageous to them. Aligning of exposure to losses wasn't always accurate, and then some of their base rates, we saw some errors in the base rates that they were applying. So different things that we found kind of going through this analysis, and just that's sort of what happens when you're kind of doing a deep dive into your data and your algorithms and your underwriting approach and your guidelines. Is some of these findings may come up that you weren't necessarily anticipating going into the process. Okay, so we've got 15 more minutes. I'm going to go through the last case study here, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So my last case study here, we're using a slightly different approach. So instead of doing our underwriting analytics, we're looking at and doing a per member loss ratio analysis. So just a slightly different approach, but similar objectives, considerations, throughout the process. Okay, so for this pool, they had auto GL work comp coverages. They were just municipalities. They had over 300 members, and all of their members need to participate in all of the coverages. They can't choose from one coverage to another. Their rating algorithm had evolved over time. The rates were calculated. They calculated their rates in total, and they allocated it to the member. They have various modifications that they do to the rate, and their funding include a discounted safety margin. Okay, so their specific situation, their total work comp contribution is less than the actual indication. And as a result, the P&L program was subsidizing the work comp program. So on a combined basis, they had enough funding between the two programs, but the P&L was subsidizing the work comp. They did have some poor performing members that were driving up the rate and were being subsidized by the better performing members. And as a result, they lost a very good large member to the commercial market over rate. This was a big shock for them because it was a very good member. It was one of their largest members, and they left for the commercial market, and it really sort of let them know that there was something wrong here, and they really need to do a deeper dive into the rating algorithm and how they rate their other members, just to make sure that they don't run into the same situation again. So what was their objective going through this process? It was to improve their rating algorithm, to make sure that, or improve the equity amongst the members, and eliminate the program subsidy. They didn't want the P&L to subsidize the work comp anymore. Okay, so what were our overall results to the pool at the end of this analysis? Well, we worked with them closely throughout the analysis, kind of talking about initial observations, getting their feedback throughout the process. At the end, we provided a detailed analysis to the management team first, talked about what we were seeing, made some suggestions on how they could make some changes, and then we were asked to speak to the board as well. So we presented with the management team to the board about our overall results and considerations and potential next steps. And we kind of laid out the decisions that the board needed to decide on, make decisions on in order to move forward. And then we helped this pool develop a stage plan in order to reach their goal, to be able to get the equity in their rates and remove the subsidies. Okay, so what were their results? What were some of the results of our analysis? So here, what I'm showing is, this is just kind of focusing on work comp for right now, and these are the overall results allocated to each member. So we have historical experience that we looked at for 5 years, and for each member, it was calculated, and we compiled the loss experience for 5 years, actual losses from each of the members, and calculated loss ratios. And you can see that in the table here. So you can see the loss, and it's grouped by loss ratio. So the loss ratio range, so 0 to 20, 20 to 40, etc., the average loss ratio in that range, and then the number of members that were in that loss ratio. Okay, so the members that were negatively impacting the overall experience were the ones that were identified in our analysis for further review. So we kind of looked at those members that had the highest loss ratio and kind of focused our analysis on them. And we made sure when we were looking at the members and grouping them that we counted for not only size of member but also the volatility experience. We wanted to make sure we took that into consideration. And then this, in our analysis, really kind of highlighted the shortcomings of their current approach, in that the loss ratio would be reduced by 18% if they selected the minimum indicated contribution amount. Okay. Now here for P&L, we did the same sort of summary for P&L, overall results allocated by member. Here I'm just showing it slightly differently. I'm showing you the results by contribution band. So it's the same, years of experience combined for all members, and I'm just sort of showing you by contribution band where the members fall and what the average loss ratio is for the members within that contribution band. And as you can see here, that you would expect to see approximately the same loss ratio regardless of the contribution band. And I think they do a pretty good job here of doing that. You can see there's fairly good equity in loss ratios across the contribution bands. In looking at this, members, where the total average P&L contribution is greater than 50,000, accounts for both 63% of the total losses and 63% of the contribution. So here we feel pretty good that the P&L program is working pretty good. Okay, so in comparing the comp to the P&L, the comp experience has been significantly worse than the P&L. Members typically have poor experience in either work comp or P&L, but not generally both. There's only 7 members that have high loss ratios in both coverages. And in general, we saw that the severity, not the frequency, was really the driving force behind the poor experience. Okay, so when we did our per member analysis, what we did is we allocated contributions to individual members using an actuarial approach. So we're not using the rating algorithm, we're using an actuarial approach that reflects each member's historical loss experience. So in order to develop this approach, we actually looked at 4 different allocation methods to determine which one would be the best. So we looked at 2 experience periods. So that's, loss history over 5 years or loss history over 7 years. And then we looked at 2 different loss limits. So losses limited to 500,000 versus losses limited to 100,000. Okay. And what we found is that, and then we sort of added excess losses back in after that. So those are the 4 different allocation approaches that we looked at. And we ended up, for each allocation approach, we developed what we call an actuarial mod. So there's relativities per member, and with the overall rate being coming from a funding study. And we decided to select the 5-year experience period with losses limited to 100,000 for our analysis, because we felt that that was the best approach for comparing to the rating algorithm. Okay, we thought that that was the best approach to coming up with the actuarial mod. Okay. So what we did is our analysis really looks at that actuarial mod and it compares it to the current pool modification. Okay, so here we're just sort of showing the results of that, how that plays out for these members in this pool. Okay, so remember the per member relativity is the member rate, the rate for each member based on the actual indication, divided by the overall rate to fund all the risk of the pool. Okay, and then the pool modification is just their net debit credit. So if the actuarial mod, what we're showing here is the relativity is less than 1. So if the actuarial mod is less than 1, what we're saying, the actual analysis is saying that the members should be getting a credit in the rating algorithm. Now, when we look at these members and how they're being treated in the current pool rating algorithm, we're seeing that 40 members are actually getting, are greater than 1. So they're actually getting a debit and not a credit. But they do have 200 members that are getting a credit, which is in line with what we would expect. But they have a problem with these 40 members that are getting a debit that should be getting a credit. Okay, now if we look at the actual mod is greater than 1. So here we're saying that these members should be getting a debit in their rating algorithm. So when we look to the rating algorithm, 29 of the members are in fact getting a debit, so that's good, so that's in line. But there are 20 members within their pool that are getting a debit. I'm sorry, they're getting a credit that really should be getting a debit according to the actual indications based on their own loss experience. So this is kind of where we start with. We want to know all these pools, these members, because this is really where the problem is that they should be getting a debit and they're getting a credit. And so we want to investigate this further. Okay, so now what we did is so in thinking about how to improve the rating algorithm, we made sort of some suggestions of things that they could consider as far as improving the program. And one that we suggested here, illustrate here, we had several suggestions, but one was just a relatively simple approach, sort of a tiering method that we suggested to tier each of the members based on their actual experience. So we have 3 buckets in place. So tier 1 are your best members. So these are members that have they're credible, they have credible loss experience, and their actuarial mod is less than 0.95. So for these members, we're going to give them a credit of 0.25. Okay, and then we have sort of the average group. So these are members that are in the average, either their experience is not credible, so we don't really know if they're good or bad risks, so that we put them automatically in this group, or their relativities, their actuarial mods are between 0.95 and 1.05, so just around that, right around 1. So these folks we're just going to put in the average bucket, and they're not going to get a debit or credit. They factor of 1 applied to their rates. And then you have tier 3, which is your worst members. So these are members that have credible data where the actuarial mod is greater than 1.05. And here we would give them a debit of 25%. Okay, and we're suggesting that these factors be applied before any other pool modifications. So you could then go in and further enhance the rating algorithm for any other specific risk management adjustments that you need to make. But this is what we were suggesting, at least to start off, to recognize and represent the member's actual experience based on an actuarial indication. Okay, so this is just sort of what the fallout was, so the impact to the members if you were to go through and adopt our tier program that we have suggested. Okay, so so we suggest a 3-tier program. If we go and adopt that, what is the impact to the current members? So for the tier 1, we identified 54 members would be in tier 1. Of those members, 4, so remember they're getting a credit. So 4 of those members are getting a debit. So they would now get a credit. They'd be happy about that. 29 members are getting a credit, and so they wouldn't necessarily have a problem with getting a credit again. And then you've got 21 members that are sort of between that don't get as much as a 20 that get are between sort of a 0.25 and a 1.0 credit. So they're ones that you need to think about. Sort of are they going to be happy with that? Probably getting more of a credit. But you just want to make sure that you're communicating correctly with these folks, particularly with those folks that are getting more than 25%. They're going to get less of a credit. Now you want to make sure that there's some communication there. But we went through and we identified the impact to each and every member based on what our suggested algorithm would be.
Chris?
Sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
Chris, we have a question from one of the attendees that they asked just about a minute or so ago, asking how you calculate credibility based on some of the information you presented on slide 76.
Yes.
So it's
an actuarial concept. It's called a Bullman credibility. It's rather a lengthy calculation. I'm sure I'd be happy to share it with you, but there is an actuarial approach to apply credibility. And it's based on a formula, and it's something that's used commonly within the industry.
Thank you.
Okay. So here, just kind of coming back to this one slide, and we're almost sort of through this discussion, but tier 2, just again, same approach, identifying the members that we're going to put in tier 2, where they are currently with the pool algorithm and what the impact is going to be to them. And then lastly, in tier 3, so these members we're saying, need to be getting a debit. 12 of them are currently getting a credit. We need to make sure we're communicating with these folks, we understand who these folks are, and making sure that information is represented to them appropriately, to the extent that we want to make that change. Okay, and then just another summary of the impact for this one particular pool and how the rates would change by member, by tier, in order to kind of get the result that we're looking at, sort of adjust their current algorithm with our approach. Okay, so just in summary, we've gone through the three case studies in detail, provided the results of those. So now just to wrap up our webinar, just a few things to touch on. So in summary, what we mentioned. So reevaluating your contribution algorithm. Why are we going to do this? There are some external influences. Perhaps it's operational considerations, or perhaps it's just due diligence. What do we need to keep in mind? We have to have certain objectives going into it, whether they're housekeeping or significant changes. We need to make sure we understand what our objectives are. We need to make sure we understand all the considerations of going through this process. We need to make sure we communicate the benefits of this, not only to the management team, but to the members, to the board. And then we certainly need to understand any consequences of our actions. Okay? And then how did we go through this process? We either did underwriting predictive analytics approach, or we did a per member loss ratio approach. There's other ways of doing this, or there can be some hybrid of those two. So we've sort of presented two different results, two different approaches here, but you can sort of combine those and use different approaches from each of those to do this analysis. So that is what I had, Stephanie. I'm right at 3 o'clock, so I'm hoping that this gives us, this is not a problem for you if we need to collect some questions.
Not at all. Before we open it up, if folks want to stick around for a couple of minutes for questions, I want to say thank you for your time, Chris. For our attendees, we will post all the material online. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the question or chat box. We can go a couple minutes over for those who want to stick around. And if you don't, you can send email questions to us at info@agrip.org, and I'll coordinate getting those questions to Chris. Chris, we don't have a question, but we do have a really nice compliment for what you presented from one of our attendees who just says, great presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being part of this. Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to raise? Please share them in the questions box. We've got a silent group of folks, Chris.
Okay.
So with that, why don't we sign off? And I'll just leave it here. For our attendees, we hope to see you in Vancouver for the August CEO and Senior Staff Institute. And we hope to see some of your staff and colleagues in Portland in October for the Fall Educational Forum. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a lovely remainder of the day.
Great. Thank you very much. Take care.